The words hit me like a physical blow. Mom, you're becoming a financial burden. Maybe it's time you consider moving into one of those senior communities. My son Brandon stood in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I'd made him countless meals, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd celebrated every achievement of his 32 years of life. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, checking his expensive watch like our conversation was keeping him from something more important. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 68 years old. I never thought I'd be sharing this story with strangers, but sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who teach you the hardest lessons about your own worth. What Brandon didn't know that day in my kitchen was that his words would set in motion a series of events that would change both our lives forever. I had raised Brandon completely on my own, after my husband Richard died in a construction accident when Brandon was only 6 years old. Richard had been working on a high-rise building downtown when the scaffolding collapsed. The settlement money from the construction company, along with Richard's life insurance, had been carefully invested and managed over the years. I'd worked as a bookkeeper at a local accounting firm, but that money had been what allowed me to give Brandon opportunities I never could have afforded otherwise. Private music lessons when he showed an interest in piano. Summer camps when other kids were going. A car for his 16th birthday. College tuition at an expensive private university because he'd gotten into their business program. Every major purchase, every opportunity, every advantage I'd given him had come from that carefully preserved nest egg that Richard had died to provide. I'd lived modestly, saving every penny I could. My house was the same small ranch home Richard and I had bought when we were newlyweds. My car was a 15-year-old Honda that I maintained religiously because I couldn't afford a new one. I shopped at discount stores, clipped coupons, and wore clothes until they literally fell apart. Not because I was poor, but because every dollar I didn't spend on myself was a dollar I could invest in Brandon's future. When Brandon graduated from college, I'd given him $50,000 as a graduation gift to help him get started in life. When he wanted to buy his first house, I'd helped with the down payment. When he'd started his consulting business 5 years ago, I'd invested another $100,000 to help him get established. I'd never asked for any of it back. I'd never expected any of it back. Seeing him succeed was payment enough. But somewhere along the way, Brandon had started to see my generosity not as love but as weakness. He'd begun treating me not as his mother, who had sacrificed everything for him, but as an obligation he had to manage. The phone calls became shorter and less frequent. The visits became rushed and impersonal. When he did come by, he'd spend most of the time on his phone, dealing with business calls that apparently couldn't wait an hour. The worst part was watching him with his wife, Jessica. She was beautiful, ambitious, and came from a wealthy family in the suburbs. When they'd gotten married 3 years ago, I could see immediately that I didn't fit into their vision of success. At family gatherings, Jessica would introduce me to her friends as Brandon's mom in a tone that suggested I was some kind of embarrassing relative they had to tolerate. I'd tried to connect with Jessica. I'd offered to help with their wedding planning, only to be told they'd already hired a professional coordinator. I'd offered to babysit when they went out of town, only to be told they preferred to use their regular nanny service. Every gesture of love or support was politely deflected, and I began to feel like an outsider in my own son's life. The day Brandon called me a financial burden started like any other. He'd called that morning and asked if he could stop by after work because he wanted to discuss something important. I'd been excited, thinking maybe he wanted my advice on something, or perhaps Jessica was pregnant, and they wanted to share the news with me personally. Instead, he'd walked into my kitchen with a folder full of papers and a spreadsheet on his laptop. He'd spent 20 minutes showing me charts and graphs about my expenses, my healthcare costs, and my declining assets. He'd spoken to me like I was a client at his consulting firm, not his mother. The reality is, Mom, you're getting older, and your expenses are only going to increase. Your house needs work, your car is becoming unreliable, and your healthcare costs are going to skyrocket in the next decade. Meanwhile, your savings are declining steadily. I'd sat there listening to him dissect my financial life like a business problem that needed solving. He'd calculated my monthly expenses down to the penny, projected my healthcare needs based on actuarial tables, and determined that I was going to become a significant financial liability within the next 5 to 7 years. "I've found a really nice senior living community about an hour from here," he'd continued, sliding a glossy brochure across my kitchen table. "They have different levels of care, so you could start in independent living and then transition to assisted living when you need it. The buy-in fee is reasonable, and it would take care of all your housing and healthcare needs." I'd picked up the brochure with trembling hands. Pine Valley Senior Living. The pictures showed smiling elderly people playing cards, doing crafts, eating meals in a communal dining room. It looked pleasant enough, but it wasn't my home. It wasn't the house where Richard and I had planned to grow old together, where I'd raised my son, where every room held memories of the life we'd built together. "Brandon," I'd said quietly, "I don't want to leave my house. This is my home." He'd sighed in frustration, the same sound he'd made as a teenager when I'd asked him to clean his room or finish his homework. "Mom, you have to be practical. You can't maintain this house forever. And frankly, Jessica and I are planning to start a family soon, and we need to think about our own financial future. We can't be responsible for supporting you indefinitely." That's when he'd said the words that changed everything. The words about me being a financial burden, as if 32 years of love, sacrifice, and support had been reduced to a line item on a balance sheet that was no longer profitable. I'd managed to keep my composure until he left, nodding and agreeing to think about it and consider my options. But after his car pulled out of my driveway, I'd sat at my kitchen table and cried harder than I had since Richard's funeral. The next morning, I'd done something I hadn't done in years. I'd called my financial advisor, Thomas Morrison, and asked him to come to my house. Thomas had been managing my investments since Richard died, and he knew better than anyone what my true financial situation was. Thomas was a kind man in his 50s, who had always treated me with respect and patience. When he arrived that afternoon, I could see the concern in his eyes as I explained what Brandon. Thomas had said gently, "I need you to understand. You're not a financial burden to anyone. You're not even close to being in financial trouble." He'd opened his laptop and shown me my investment portfolio, something I hadn't looked at in detail for months. The numbers on the screen had shocked me. Despite all the money I'd given Brandon over the years, despite my modest withdrawals for living expenses, the investments had grown significantly. Between your original investments, the appreciation over the years, and the additional contributions you've made from your bookkeeping income, your portfolio is worth just over $2.8 million. I'd stared at the number, unable to process it. "That can't be right." "It absolutely is. Your husband chose excellent investments, and we've managed them conservatively but effectively. You could live very comfortably on the income from these investments for the rest of your life without ever touching the principal. In fact, you could probably triple your current spending and still be financially secure." Thomas had leaned forward, his expression serious. "Margaret, has Brandon ever asked you about your actual financial situation? Has he asked to see your investment statements, or talk to me directly?" I'd shaken my head. Brandon had never shown any interest in the details of my finances. He'd just assumed, apparently, that because I lived modestly and drove an old car, I must be struggling financially. "There's something else you should know," Thomas had continued. "Do you remember the trust fund you set up for Brandon when he turned 21? I'd nodded. It had been Richard's idea originally. He'd wanted to make sure that if anything happened to us, Brandon would be financially secure. After Richard died, I'd continued contributing to it, adding money every year on Brandon's birthday. That trust currently has a value of $1-2 million. Brandon is the beneficiary, and according to the terms you set up, he'll receive full access to it when he turns 35, which is in 3 years." I'd sat in stunned silence. My son, who had just told me I was a financial burden, was 3 years away from inheriting over $1 million that I had saved and invested for him. Money that he had no idea existed, because I'd wanted it to be a surprise, a gift that would secure his future just as Richard had wanted. "What are my options with the trust?" I'd asked. Thomas had pulled out the original documents. As the creator and current trustee, you have broad discretion. You can change the beneficiary, you can alter the distribution terms, or you can dissolve the trust entirely and redirect the funds elsewhere. That night, I'd sat in my living room looking at family photos and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Pictures of Brandon as a little boy, losing his first tooth, playing Little League baseball, graduating from high school. Pictures of Richard holding his newborn son, teaching him to ride a bike, helping him build a treehouse in our backyard. I'd thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, all the opportunities I'd passed up, all the ways I'd put Brandon's needs and wants ahead of my own. And I'd thought about how he'd looked at me across my kitchen table the day before, like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. But I'd also thought about the animals at the shelter, where I'd been volunteering for the past 5 years. After I'd retired from bookkeeping, I'd needed something to fill my time, and the Riverside County Animal Shelter had been desperate for volunteers. I'd started by just walking dogs and cleaning cages, but over time, I'd become more involved in their operations. The shelter was chronically underfunded. They operated in a building that was falling apart, with outdated equipment and not enough space for all the animals that needed help. Every month, they had to make heartbreaking decisions about which animals to keep and which ones they simply couldn't afford to care for anymore. I'd seen the staff members, most of them young people, who'd chosen to work with animals despite the low pay and emotionally difficult conditions. I'd watched them cry when they had to euthanize healthy animals simply because there wasn't enough money to keep them alive. I'd seen them spend their own paychecks to buy food and medical supplies when the shelter's budget ran out. These people, most of whom barely knew me, treated me with more respect and kindness than my own son had shown me in years. They valued my contributions, appreciated my help, and made me feel needed and useful. When I walked into that shelter, I wasn't a financial burden or an aging inconvenience. I was Margaret, the volunteer who always remembered to bring extra dog treats and who could calm down even the most anxious rescue animals. The idea came to me gradually, over several sleepless nights. If Brandon saw me as nothing more than a financial liability, then perhaps it was time he learned what it meant to actually face financial challenges on his own. And if he couldn't see the value in supporting his mother, maybe he could learn to appreciate the value of supporting creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. I'd called Thomas the next week and asked him to come to my house again. This time, I'd had a proposal for him. I want to change the beneficiary of Brandon's trust fund, I'd said. Thomas had raised his eyebrows. Are you sure about this, Margaret? This is a significant decision. Once it's done, it can't easily be undone. I'm absolutely sure. I want to split the money between 3 different animal welfare organizations. 50% to the Riverside County Animal Shelter, 25% to the Regional Animal Rescue Network, and 25% to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Thomas had been quiet for a long moment. Margaret, this is $2 million we're talking about. Are you certain you want to do this? I'd looked around my living room, at the pictures of Brandon, at the home I'd built with Richard, at the life I'd created through decades of careful planning and sacrifice. Thomas, I've spent 32 years investing in my son's future. I've given him every opportunity, every advantage, every blessing I could provide. And yesterday, he told me I was a financial burden, and suggested I move into a nursing home, so I wouldn't interfere with his plans to start a family. I'd paused, feeling a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. These animal organizations save lives every day with almost no resources. They perform miracles on shoestring budgets. They never ask for more than they need, and they're grateful for every dollar they receive. If my money is going to help someone build a future, I'd rather it help them build futures for creatures who can't advocate for themselves. Thomas had nodded slowly. I'll draw up the paperwork. But Margaret, what are you going to tell Brandon? I'd smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. I'm going to tell him exactly what he told me, that it's time to be practical about our financial futures. The paperwork had taken 2 weeks to complete. During that time, I'd continued my normal routine, volunteering at the shelter, tending to my small garden, maintaining my house. Brandon had called once to check if I'd made any decisions about the senior living community, and I'd told him I was still considering my options. On a Tuesday morning in late September, I'd called Brandon and asked him to come over for dinner that evening. I'd told him I had something important to discuss, and he'd agreed to come by after work. I'd spent the day cooking his favorite meal, the same lasagna I'd made for his birthday every year since he was 7 years old. When Brandon arrived that evening, he'd seemed more relaxed than he had during our previous conversation. He'd hugged me hello and complimented the smell coming from the kitchen. For a moment, I'd remembered the little boy who used to run to me when he got home from school, eager to tell me about his day. We'd eaten dinner and made small talk about his work, about Jessica's job at the marketing firm, about their plans for the upcoming holidays. It felt almost normal, almost like the relationship we'd had before success and money and social expectations had created distance between us. After dinner, I'd served him coffee and the chocolate cake I'd made from his grandmother's recipe. That's when I'd told him, "Brandon, I've made a decision about my financial future," I'd said, setting down my coffee cup. "You were right when you said I needed to be more practical about planning ahead." He'd leaned forward, looking relieved. "I'm glad you're being sensible about this, Mom. I know it's hard to think about leaving this house, but Pine Valley really is a nice place. And once you're settled there, you won't have to worry about maintenance or repairs, or any of that stuff." "Actually," I'd said, "I've decided not to move to Pine Valley." His face had fallen. "Mom, we talked about this. You can't keep pretending you can maintain this lifestyle indefinitely." "You're absolutely right," I'd agreed. "Which is why I've made some changes to ensure my financial security." I'd pulled out the folder Thomas had prepared for me, containing copies of all the legal documents we'd filed. "I've restructured some of my investments to better align with my values and priorities." Brandon had looked confused. "What kind of restructuring?" "Well, for starters, I've redirected the trust fund I set up for you." The color had drained from his face. "What trust fund?" I'd opened the folder and shown him the original trust documents, the ones I'd signed 27 years ago, when he was 5 years old. "Your father and I established this trust to ensure your financial security. I've been contributing to it every year since his death. As of last week, it was worth $2 million. Brandon had stared at the papers, his mouth hanging open. "Mom, I had no idea this existed. I wanted it to be a surprise for your 35th birthday, a gift to help you and Jessica buy your dream house, maybe start that family you've been planning." He'd looked up at me, hope and confusion warring in his expression. "Was worth? What do you mean was worth?" I'd turned to the next page in the folder, showing him the change of beneficiary forms. "I've transferred the funds to 3 animal welfare organizations: the Riverside County Animal Shelter, the Regional Animal Rescue Network, and the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center." The silence that followed had been deafening. Brandon had read through the documents twice, his face growing paler with each page. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been panic. "You gave away my inheritance to animal shelters." His voice had been barely above a whisper. "I redirected funds that belong to me to organizations that I believe will use them responsibly." I'd corrected. "Just like you suggested I should be more practical about my financial planning." Brandon had stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup. The dark liquid had spread across my kitchen table, soaking into the documents. "Mom, you can't do this. This is insane. That money was supposed to be for me, for my future. According to you, I don't have a future worth investing in," I'd said calmly, cleaning up the spilled coffee with paper towels. "You made it very clear that I'm a financial burden who needs to get out of the way, so you and Jessica can focus on your own financial security." "That's not what I meant." Brandon had started pacing around my small kitchen. "I was trying to help you plan for your retirement, to make sure you'd be taken care of. By putting me in a nursing home an hour away, so I wouldn't interfere with your life." "It's not a nursing home, it's a senior living community, and I thought it would be good for you to be around other people your age, to have activities and social opportunities." I'd looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who was now frantically trying to backtrack from words that couldn't be taken back.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Brandon, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted? When was the last time you asked if I was happy, or lonely, or needed anything? He'd stopped pacing and stared at me. I don't know. I assumed you'd tell me if you needed something. I told you last month that my washing machine was making strange noises, and you said I should call a repair service. I told you at Jessica's birthday party that I'd been having trouble sleeping, and you said I should talk to my doctor. I told you at Christmas that I missed spending time with you, and you said you'd been busy with work but things would slow down soon. Brandon had sat back down heavily in his chair. Mom, I didn't realize. You didn't realize because you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a responsibility, and not even a pleasant responsibility, but an inconvenient one that you wanted to manage as efficiently as possible. I'd sat down across from him, the same position we'd been in 2 weeks earlier when he'd presented me with his charts and graphs about my declining assets. Do you want to know what my actual financial situation is? He'd nodded mutely. I'd pulled out the investment statements Thomas had prepared for me. I have $8 million in various investments. I own this house outright. I have excellent health insurance and long-term care insurance. I could afford to hire full-time help if I needed it. I could afford to renovate this entire house, and I could afford to travel the world if I wanted to. Brandon had stared at the numbers, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked like embarrassment. If you have all this money, why do you live like you're poor? Because I was raised to believe that having money didn't mean you had to waste money. Because I wanted to leave something behind for you and your children. Because I thought being modest and frugal were virtues, not signs of poverty. I'd leaned forward, trying to make him understand. Brandon, I've been volunteering at the animal shelter for 5 years. Do you know how much their annual operating budget is? He'd shaken his head. $800,000. For an entire year, to care for thousands of animals, to provide medical treatment, to find homes for abandoned pets, to rescue animals from abuse and neglect. Your trust fund alone could fund their operations for over a year. I'd stood up and walked to my refrigerator, where I kept photos of some of the dogs I'd helped place in homes over the years. This is Bella, a pit bull who was found chained in a backyard with no food or water. The shelter spent $3,000 on surgery to repair the damage from her infected collar wound. This is Max, a senior dog whose owners abandoned him when they moved. The shelter spent $2,000 on treatment for his arthritis and diabetes, and then spent months finding him a home with a family who could manage his medical needs. Brandon had looked at the photos, but I could tell he was still processing the magnitude of what I'd done. These organizations save lives every day with almost nothing. I'd continued. They never complain about their budgets, they never call needy animals a burden, and they never suggest that old sick animals should just be put down to save money. They fight for every life, no matter how expensive or inconvenient it might be. I'd sat back down and looked directly at my son. So when you told me I was becoming a financial burden, when you suggested I should move myself out of the way to make your life easier, I realized that maybe my money would be better invested in organizations that understand the value of caring for vulnerable creatures who can't advocate for themselves. Brandon had put his head in his hands. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sound uncaring. I was trying to be responsible to help you plan ahead. You were trying to manage me like a business problem. You presented me with a solution that would cost me my independence, my home, and my connection to everything familiar, and you acted like I should be grateful for your practical thinking. He'd looked up at me with tears in his eyes. What can I do? How can I fix this? I'd reached across the table and taken his hand, the same hand I'd held when he was learning to walk, when he was scared of the dark, when he'd cried after his father's funeral. Brandon, I don't want you to fix this. I want you to understand why I did it. But Mom, that was my inheritance. That was supposed to be my security. And what about my security? What about my happiness? What about my dignity? I'd squeezed his hand gently. You have a successful business, a beautiful wife, a bright future ahead of you. You don't need that money to survive. Those animals do. Brandon had sat in silence for several minutes, still holding my hand, tears streaming down his face. Finally he'd spoken. Jessica is going to be furious. Were you planning to tell Jessica about the trust fund? He'd nodded. We were talking about using it as a down payment on a bigger house. Maybe something in Westfield, closer to her parents. I'd felt a stab of pain, realizing that Brandon had been making plans for money I'd saved without ever discussing it with me, without ever acknowledging what it represented. Did it ever occur to you to thank me for saving that money? To ask how I'd managed to set aside so much while raising you alone? Brandon had shaken his head, looking ashamed. I guess I just thought. I don't know what I thought. That Dad had left it somehow. Your father left us $50,000 in life insurance, and the settlement from his accident. Everything else, every dollar in that trust fund, came from my salary as a bookkeeper and the investments I made with money I didn't spend on myself. I'd pulled my hand away and stood up. Brandon, I want you to understand something. I didn't give that money away to punish you. I gave it away because I realized that my values and your values are no longer aligned. You see money as something to accumulate and spend on comfort and status. I see money as something to be used carefully, to help others, to make the world a little bit better. Brandon had looked around my modest kitchen, seeming to really see it for the first time in years. The old appliances that still worked perfectly, the hand-sewn curtains I'd made 20 years ago, the collection of coffee mugs from various places I'd never actually traveled to, but had received as gifts from friends who had. Mom, I never realized how little you spend on yourself. Because I was saving for your future. Because I believed that your success and happiness were more important than my comfort. I'd paused, feeling the weight of 32 years of motherhood. But you've made it clear that my well-being is not a priority for you. So I've decided to make it a priority for myself, and to use my resources to help others who share my values. Brandon had left that night without eating his cake, promising to call me in a few days when he'd had time to process everything. But I knew he wouldn't be calling anytime soon. I knew he'd be going home to Jessica, explaining why they couldn't afford the house in Westfield, dealing with her disappointment and anger. I'd cleaned up the kitchen and sat in my living room with a cup of tea, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. I was sad for the relationship I'd lost with my son, for the grandchildren I might never have a chance to know, for the family dinners and holidays that would probably never happen again. But I was also relieved. Relieved to finally stop pretending that Brandon's indifference didn't hurt. Relieved to stop making excuses for his selfishness. Relieved to use my money for something that would make a real difference in the world. The next morning, I'd called the director of the Riverside County Animal Shelter and asked if I could schedule a meeting. Linda Patterson had been running the shelter for 15 years, and I'd worked with her closely during my time as a volunteer. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, who had dedicated her career to animal welfare despite the heartbreak and frustration that came with the job. When I'd explained what I wanted to do, Linda had been speechless. We'd sat in her cramped office, surrounded by photos of animals who had been successfully adopted, while she tried to process the magnitude of what I was offering. "Margaret, this is incredible," she'd finally said. "With this kind of funding, we could build the new facility we've been dreaming about for years. We could hire additional veterinary staff, expand our adoption programs, maybe even start a low-cost spay and neuter clinic for the community." I'd smiled, feeling more excited about money than I had in years. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Linda had leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. "We could save so many more animals. We could take in the cases we've had to turn away because we couldn't afford the medical treatment. We could partner with rescue organizations in other states to help with overcrowding issues. There's just one condition," I'd said. Linda's expression had become cautious. "What's that?" "I want to be involved in the planning. I want to see exactly how the money is being used, and I want to continue volunteering here as long as I'm able." Linda had laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Margaret, you can have whatever level of involvement you want. You could be on our board of directors if you're interested." Over the following weeks, I'd met with representatives from all 3 organizations I'd chosen to support. The Regional Animal Rescue Network was thrilled to be able to expand their fostering program and improve their medical facilities. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was planning to build a new facility for injured birds of prey and expand their educational outreach programs. Each organization had presented me with detailed plans for how they would use the money, complete with timelines and measurable goals. They'd treated me with respect and gratitude, acknowledging the magnitude of my gift, while making it clear that they understood the responsibility that came with it. Meanwhile, Brandon hadn't called. Jessica had, though. 3 weeks after my dinner with Brandon, she'd shown up at my house on a Saturday afternoon, dressed in designer clothes, and driving her Mercedes, clearly prepared for battle. "Margaret, we need to talk," she'd said, when I'd opened my front door. I'd invited her in and made coffee, knowing this conversation was inevitable. Jessica had never particularly liked me, but she'd tolerated me as part of the package that came with marrying Brandon. Now, apparently, tolerance was no longer an option. "I think you know why I'm here," Jessica had said, sitting stiffly on my living room couch. "I assume Brandon told you about the trust fund." Jessica's composure had cracked slightly. "How could you do this to us? That money was supposed to be for our future, for our children's future. That money was mine to do with as I pleased," I'd replied calmly. "I chose to use it to help organizations that align with my values." "Your values?" Jessica's voice had risen. "What about family values? What about taking care of your own son?" I'd set down my coffee cup and looked directly at her. "Jessica, in the 3 years since you married my son, how many times have you invited me to your house?" She'd looked uncomfortable. "We've had you over for holidays. Twice, Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and Easter last year. Both times, you made it clear that I was an inconvenience you had to endure." "That's not true. At Thanksgiving you seated me at the children's table with your nephew's kids. At Easter, you asked me to leave early because you were having an adult dinner party later, and needed time to prepare." Jessica's face had flushed. "I was trying to include you appropriately. By treating me like a child or a servant who could be dismissed when more important guests arrived." I'd stood up and walked to my bookshelf, where I kept the photo albums from Brandon's childhood. I'd pulled out one of them, and showed Jessica pictures of birthday parties, school events, family vacations, all the memories I'd created while raising Brandon alone. "I spent 30 years building a life for my son. I gave him every opportunity I could afford, and many I couldn't really afford. I taught him to be kind, respectful, and grateful for the blessings in his life." I'd looked directly at Jessica. What I didn't teach him, apparently, was how to recognize when someone he claimed to love was being cruel to his mother. Jessica had stood up abruptly. "I've never been cruel to you. You've never been kind either. You've been politely dismissive, consistently condescending, and systematically working to minimize my role in Brandon's life." I was protecting my marriage. From what? From a 68-year-old woman who wanted to occasionally share a meal with her son. From a mother who was proud of what he'd accomplished, and wanted to be part of his happiness. Jessica had started pacing around my small living room, her designer heels clicking on my hardwood floors. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. Brandon's business is competitive, we have social obligations, we're trying to build a life together. And apparently that life has no room for the woman who made it possible." Jessica had stopped pacing, and turned to face me. "What do you want from us? What would it take for you to reconsider this decision?" I'd been quiet for a moment, thinking about what I really wanted. "I want my son back. I want the boy I raised, who used to call me just to tell me about his day, who used to ask my advice about important decisions, who used to hug me like he meant it instead of like he was completing a chore." People grow up, Margaret. They change. They develop their own lives and priorities. They don't have to become cruel. Jessica had sat back down, her expression softening slightly. "Look, I know we haven't been as attentive as we should have been, but that doesn't mean we don't care about you. Brandon talks about you all the time. He talks about me like I'm a problem to be managed, like I'm an aging pet he can't quite bring himself to put down." The words had hung in the air between us, harsh but true. Jessica had looked uncomfortable, but she hadn't denied it. "The money is gone," I'd continued. "It's been legally transferred to organizations that will use it to save lives and reduce suffering. That decision is final and irreversible. So that's it, you're just going to punish us for not being perfect." I'd shaken my head. "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm choosing to invest in kindness, compassion, and unconditional love. Things I used to think I had with my family, but apparently don't." Jessica had left that day without saying goodbye, and I hadn't heard from either of them since. That had been 4 months ago, and the silence had been both painful and peaceful. Painful because I missed my son, missed the relationship we'd once had, missed the hope of being part of his future family. But peaceful, because I no longer had to pretend that their indifference didn't hurt, no longer had to make excuses for their selfishness, no longer had to watch them treat me like an inconvenient obligation. During those 4 months, I'd thrown myself into my work with the animal organizations. I'd joined the board of directors at the Riverside County Animal Shelter, and had been elected as their treasurer, using my bookkeeping skills to help them manage their dramatically increased budget. The construction on the new shelter facility had begun, and I'd visited the site every week to check on the progress. Seeing the building take shape, knowing that it would provide better care for thousands of animals, had filled me with a satisfaction I'd never felt when writing checks for Brandon's various needs and wants. That I administered with the same care I'd once given to managing Brandon's childhood medications. These animals had become my family, and caring for them had given my life a purpose I hadn't felt in years. It was on a cold February morning, exactly 6 months after my confrontation with Brandon, that my phone rang at 7:30 in the morning. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. "Mrs. Chen, this is Dr. Patricia Rodriguez from Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Brandon Henderson." My heart stopped. Despite everything that had happened between us, he was still my son, still the little boy I'd raised and loved. "What's wrong? Is he hurt? He was brought in last night after a car accident. He's stable, but he's asking for you. He's been quite insistent that we contact you." I was dressed and in my car within 15 minutes, driving through morning traffic to the hospital across town. Max whined from the back seat, sensing my distress. I'd brought him with me because I couldn't bear the thought of being alone, and hospitals had always allowed therapy dogs in certain circumstances. When I arrived at the hospital, a kind nurse directed me to the third-floor trauma unit. Brandon was in room 314, awake but clearly in pain. His left leg was elevated and wrapped in bandages, and there were cuts on his face from what looked like broken glass. When he saw me walk through the door, he started crying. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about everything." I set my purse down and moved to his bedside, all the hurt and anger from the past months dissolving at the sight of my injured son. "Sheh, it's okay. I'm here now. What happened?" I was driving home from a client meeting last night. It was raining, and I hit a patch of ice on the highway. My car spun out and hit a tree. He winced as he tried to shift position. The doctor said I was lucky. If I'd been going faster, or if the tree had been closer to the driver's side. I reached out and smoothed his hair back from his forehead, the same gesture I'd used to comfort him when he was sick as a child. "You're going to be okay. That's all that matters." "No, Mom, it's not okay. Nothing's been okay." Brandon grabbed my hand with both of his, holding it tightly. "I've had 6 months to think about what you said, about what I did, and you were right about everything." I sat down in the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. "Brandon, you don't need to do this now. You should rest." "Yes, I do need to do this. I've been a terrible son, and I've been too proud and too stupid to admit it." Tears were streaming down his face, making the cuts from the accident look even more painful. "When you changed the trust fund, I was so angry. I felt like you'd betrayed me, like you'd stolen something that belonged to me." He paused, struggling to find the words. "But it didn't belong to me, did it? I never earned it. I never even knew it existed. You saved that money, penny by penny, year after year, while I was spending your other money on college and cars and business investments, never once thinking about what it cost you." I wanted to tell him it hadn't cost me anything, that providing for him had been my joy, but I could see he needed to say these things. "Jessica and I fought constantly after you changed the trust. Not just about the money, but about you, about our priorities, about what kind of people we'd become." Brandon's grip on my hand tightened. "She wanted me to hire a lawyer, to see if we could contest the trust changes somehow. She said you were probably getting senile, that we could argue you weren't mentally competent to make such a big financial decision." The words hurt, but they didn't surprise me. Jessica had never seen me as anything more than an obstacle to her plans. But I couldn't do it, Mom. Even as angry as I was, I couldn't convince myself that you were anything other than completely rational, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized you were right about everything you said. Brandon struggled to sit up straighter in the hospital bed, wincing from the pain in his leg. I did treat you like a financial burden. I did see you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. And I let Jessica's attitude toward you influence how I behaved, because it was easier than standing up for you. I felt tears starting to form in my own eyes. Brandon, I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but I did hurt you. I hurt you badly, and I kept hurting you because I was too selfish to see what I was doing. He looked directly at me, his eyes clear despite the pain medication he was obviously receiving. Mom, do you know what I was doing when I had the accident last night? I shook my head. I was driving home from a meeting with a divorce lawyer. The words hit me like a physical blow. Oh, Brandon, Jessica and I have been miserable for months. Once we realized the trust money was really gone, that there was no way to get it back, she started treating me the way she'd always treated you, like I was disappointing her, like I wasn't living up to her expectations. Brandon shifted in the bed again, clearly struggling with both physical and emotional pain. She started spending money we didn't have, trying to maintain the lifestyle she thought we deserved. She put a deposit down on a house in Westfield, without telling me, assuming we'd find a way to finance it. She bought a new car, designer furniture, expensive clothes. When I tried to talk to her about our budget, she said it was my fault for not providing adequately for our future. I could see the heartbreak in my son's eyes, and despite everything Jessica had done, I felt sorry for him. Marriage ending is always painful, even when it's necessary. The lawyer told me last night that Jessica had already been to see him 3 weeks ago. She's filing for divorce and asking for alimony, claiming that she gave up career opportunities to support my business development. Brandon laughed bitterly. The ironic thing is she's probably right to leave me. I don't think I'm capable of being the kind of husband she wants, or the kind of husband anyone deserves. Brandon, that's not true. It is true, Mom. Look how I treated you. Look how I let her treat you. If I can't stand up for my own mother, if I can't see past my own selfish interests long enough to treat the people I love with basic decency, then what kind of partner am I going to be for anyone? I squeezed his hand gently. People can change, honey. People can learn from their mistakes and do better. Can they? Can I? Brandon looked at me with desperate hope. Mom, I know I have no right to ask this, and I know I don't deserve it, but is there any chance you could forgive me? Is there any chance we could try to rebuild our relationship? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, lying broken in a hospital bed, finally understanding what he'd lost. The anger I'd carried for 6 months was still there, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger. Love, the kind of love that doesn't depend on good behavior or gratitude or perfect understanding. Of course I forgive you, I said softly. You're my son. I never stopped loving you, not for 1 minute. Brandon broke down completely then, sobbing like the little boy who used to run to me when he was hurt or scared. I stood up and leaned over the bed rail to hug him as best I could, being careful not to disturb his injured leg. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything. I don't know how to make it right. You don't have to make anything right, I said, stroking his hair. You just have to be better going forward. We both do. We stayed like that for several minutes, holding each other and crying, releasing months of hurt and anger and regret. It felt like a beginning, like the first honest conversation we'd had in years. When we finally pulled apart, Brandon wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Mom, can I ask you something? Anything? Are you happy? I mean, really happy with the decision you made about the trust fund? I thought about the question seriously. Yes, I am. The animal organizations have done incredible things with that money already. The new shelter facility is almost finished, and they've been able to save animals they would have had to euthanize before. The rescue network has expanded their fostering program and placed over 200 animals in homes since they received their funding. The Wildlife Center is treating injured birds and mammals they never could have helped before. Brandon nodded slowly. I want to see it. The new shelter, I mean. Would you show me what they're building? I felt a surge of hope. You really want to see it? I want to understand what was more important to you than giving me that money. I want to understand what you saw in those organizations that you didn't see in me. The next day after Brandon was released from the hospital with a cast on his leg and crutches for mobility, I picked him up and drove him to the construction site of the new Riverside County Animal Shelter. Linda Patterson met us there, eager to show off the progress they'd made. The new building was impressive, 3 times the size of the old facility, with separate wings for dogs, cats, and small animals. There were spacious outdoor runs, modern medical facilities, and rooms designed specifically for behavioral training and rehabilitation. "This is going to be our new surgical suite," Linda explained as we toured the nearly completed building. "We'll be able to perform complex operations that we had to refer to expensive private clinics before. And over here is our new isolation ward for animals recovering from illness or surgery." Brandon asked thoughtful questions about the facility, about the animals they served, about the challenges they faced. I could see him trying to understand why I'd chosen this over securing his financial future. In the old facility, we visited the animals currently waiting for adoption. Brandon was quiet as we walked through the rows of kennels, looking at dogs and cats who had been abandoned, abused, or surrendered by families who could no longer care for them. "This is Murphy," I said, stopping at the kennel of a senior dog I'd been working with. "He's 11 years old. His family brought him here when they moved to an apartment that didn't allow pets." Murphy was a gentle golden retriever mix, with gray around his muzzle and kind eyes. He'd been at the shelter for 4 months, passed over by potential adopters who wanted younger animals. "Can we take him out?" Brandon asked. Linda unlocked the kennel, and Murphy immediately walked over to Brandon, who was balancing on his crutches. The dog seemed to sense that Brandon was injured and moved carefully, allowing Brandon to pet him without losing his balance. "He's beautiful," Brandon said, scratching Murphy behind the ears. "Why hasn't anyone adopted him?" "Senior dogs are hard to place," Linda explained. "People worry about medical expenses, about not having enough time with them, about getting attached to an animal they might lose soon." Brandon was quiet for a moment, still petting Murphy, but he's got years of love left to give. "Exactly," I said. "He's got so much love to give, and all he needs is someone willing to receive it." We spent another hour at the shelter, and I could see something changing in Brandon's face as he interacted with the animals and talked with the staff members. These were people who had dedicated their careers to helping creatures who couldn't help themselves, people who worked for modest salaries because they believed their work mattered more than their paychecks. On the drive home, Brandon was unusually quiet. Finally he spoke up. "Mom, I think I'm starting to understand." "Understand what?" "Why you chose them over me. They're not selfish, they're not demanding, they're grateful for whatever help they get, and they use every dollar to make life better for someone else." I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. "Brandon, I didn't choose them over you. I chose compassion over entitlement. I chose gratitude over expectation. Those are values I tried to teach you when you were growing up, but somehow you lost sight of them along the way." Brandon nodded slowly. "I know, and I know it's my fault, not yours. You did teach me those things. I just forgot them when I got caught up in trying to impress Jessica and her family, trying to build this perfect, successful life." We sat in the car for a few more minutes, both of us processing the day. Finally Brandon turned to me with a determined expression. "Mom, I want to do something. I want to make a donation to the animal shelter." I was surprised. "Brandon, you don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. Not to try to make up for the trust fund, because I know, but because I want to contribute to something meaningful, something that matters." "How much were you thinking?" Brandon was quiet for a moment. "I want to donate enough to sponsor Murphy's adoption, to cover his medical expenses for life, so that some family will be willing to take him home." I felt tears welling up in my eyes again. "That's a wonderful idea, and I want to volunteer there. Once my leg heals and I can get around better, I want to help out however I can." Over the following weeks, Brandon kept his word. He donated $5,000 to create a senior dog sponsorship program, with Murphy as the first beneficiary. Within a week, Murphy had been adopted by a retired couple who had recently lost their own elderly dog and were looking for another companion. Brandon also started volunteering at the shelter, initially just helping with administrative tasks he could do while seated, but gradually taking on more responsibilities as his leg healed. I watched him with the animals, saw how patient and gentle he was with the scared and injured ones, and I began to see glimpses of the compassionate boy I'd raised. The divorce proceedings with Jessica were ugly, as I'd expected they would be. She was demanding half of Brandon's business assets, claiming she'd contributed to his success through her social connections and marketing expertise. She was also asking for substantial alimony, arguing that she'd sacrificed her own career potential to support Brandon's professional development. The ironic thing, Brandon told me one evening, as we were preparing dinner together in my kitchen, is that she's probably going to end up with more money from the divorce than we ever would have gotten from the trust fund, at least in the short term. Are you angry about that? Brandon considered the question, while he chopped vegetables for our salad. It had become a routine over the past month, him coming to my house for dinner several times a week, both of us enjoying the company, and the chance to rebuild our relationship slowly. I'm not angry, he said finally. I'm sad that our marriage came to this, but I'm not angry about the money. Jessica has certain expectations about lifestyle and status that I'm never going to be able to meet, at least not in the way she wants. It's better for both of us, if we recognize that now. I could see that Brandon had matured significantly over the past few months. The experience of losing the trust fund, going through a divorce, and volunteering with animals who had suffered abandonment and abuse, had given him a perspective he'd never had before. Have you thought about what you want to do after the divorce is final? I asked. Actually, I have been thinking about that. Brandon set down his knife and turned to face me. Mom, would you think I was crazy if I told you I was considering making some major changes to my business? What kind of changes? I've been doing consulting work for corporations, helping them maximize profits and streamline operations. It pays well, but it's not exactly fulfilling. Brandon leaned against the kitchen counter, his expression thoughtful. What if I used those same skills to help nonprofit organizations? Animal rescues, food banks, homeless shelters, organizations that are trying to do good work, but don't have the business expertise to operate efficiently. I felt a surge of pride in my son. That sounds like meaningful work. It wouldn't pay nearly as much as corporate consulting. I'd probably have to sell my house, get a smaller apartment, drive my car until it falls apart instead of trading it in every few years. How do you feel about that? Brandon smiled, and for the first time in years, it looked genuine. Honestly, it feels liberating. I've been so focused on accumulating wealth and status symbols that I forgot what it felt like to do work that actually mattered. Your father would be proud of you, I said, meaning it completely. Brandon's eyes filled with tears. Do you really think so? I know so. He always said that success wasn't measured by how much money you made, but by how much good you did in the world. That night, after Brandon had gone home, I sat in my living room with Max and Stella, thinking about how much our lives had changed over the past year. The house that had felt so empty and quiet after Brandon's rare visits was now full of life and purpose. I had my son back, not the entitled man who had called me a financial burden, but the compassionate person I'd raised him to be. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Linda Patterson from the animal shelter. Margaret, I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all, Linda. What's going on? I have some news I wanted to share with you. We just got word that the state is awarding us a contract to manage animal control services for 3 additional counties. It's a huge opportunity to expand our reach and help even more animals. I felt a thrill of excitement. That's wonderful news. It's all because of the reputation we've built since opening the new facility. The state officials were impressed by our modern facilities, our medical capabilities, and our adoption success rates. None of that would have been possible without your donation. After I hung up with Linda, I realized that the money I'd redirected from Brandon's trust fund was continuing to multiply its impact. Not just through the immediate improvements to the facilities and programs, but through the expanded opportunities those improvements had created. The next morning, Brandon called me early, sounding excited about something. Mom, I have an idea. What would you think about us taking a trip together? A trip? Where? I've been researching animal sanctuaries and rescue organizations around the country. There's an incredible place in Utah that rescues and rehabilitates wildlife, and another one in North Carolina that specializes in farm animal rescue. I thought maybe we could visit them, see how they operate, maybe learn some things that could help the organizations here. The idea filled me with unexpected joy. I hadn't traveled anywhere in years, had never felt like I had anyone to travel with or anywhere I particularly wanted to go. But the thought of exploring the country with Brandon, visiting places that aligned with our shared values, sounded like the adventure I'd been missing without even realizing it. I'd love that, I said. When were you thinking of going? Well, the divorce should be final next month, and I'm planning to restructure my business over the summer. Maybe we could take a couple of weeks in June. We spent the next hour planning our trip, researching animal sanctuaries and rescue organizations, mapping out a route that would take us through several states. For the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to the future with genuine excitement. That afternoon, I was working in my garden when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked up to see Jessica's white Mercedes, and my heart sank. I hadn't spoken to her since our confrontation months earlier, and I couldn't imagine this visit would be pleasant. Jessica got out of her car looking as perfectly put together as always, but I could see tension in her posture and dark circles under her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite conceal. "Hello, Margaret," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Jessica, this is a surprise. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to talk to you before the divorce is finalized." I gestured toward the patio furniture on my back deck. "Would you like to sit down? I can make some coffee." "That would be nice." I went inside and prepared coffee, wondering what Jessica could possibly want to discuss with me. When I returned to the deck, she was sitting stiffly in one of my old patio chairs, looking out of place among my simple outdoor furniture. "I suppose Brandon told you about the divorce," she said, accepting the coffee cup I offered her. "He mentioned it, yes. I'm sorry things didn't work out between you." Jessica looked surprised by my response. "Are you really sorry? I figured you'd be happy to see us split up." I sat down across from her, considering her question honestly. "I'm sorry that you're both unhappy. I'm sorry that your marriage didn't fulfill whatever hopes you had when you got married. I'm not sorry that Brandon is no longer married to someone who treated his mother with contempt." Jessica winced at my directness, but she didn't deny it. "You're right, I did treat you badly. I treated you like an inconvenience, like someone I had to tolerate but didn't have to respect." I waited, not sure where this conversation was heading. "The thing is," Jessica continued, "I think I was threatened by you." "Threatened by me? Why?" Jessica set down her coffee cup and looked directly at me for the first time since she'd arrived. "Because Brandon loved you. Really loved you. And I could see that no matter how successful he became, no matter how much money he made or how impressive our life looked from the outside, he was never going to love me the way he loved you." The honesty in her voice surprised me. "Jessica, a man's love for his mother is different from his love for his wife. They don't have to compete with each other." "I know that now," she said quietly. "But I didn't know it then. I saw how his whole face would light up when he talked about things you'd done together when he was growing up. I saw how proud he was of your strength, raising him alone after his father died. And I realized that I would never be that important to him, never mean that much to him." Jessica paused, struggling with emotions I'd never seen her express before. "So instead of trying to build my own relationship with him, instead of trying to become someone he could respect and admire, I decided to tear down his relationship with you. I thought if I could make you less important in his life, it would make me more important. And how did that work out for you?" Jessica laughed bitterly. "It backfired completely. The more I pushed Brandon to distance himself from you, the more resentful he became, not of you, but of me. He could sense what I was doing, even if he couldn't articulate it at the time. I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication that my instincts about Jessica's behavior had been correct, but sadness that 3 people's lives had been damaged by her insecurity and jealousy." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I wanted to apologize, and because I wanted you to know that losing that trust fund money probably saved Brandon from making an even bigger mistake." I raised my eyebrows. "What do you mean?" Jessica looked uncomfortable, but continued. "If we'd gotten that money, if we'd bought the house in Westfield and settled into the lifestyle I wanted, Brandon would have been miserable. He would have spent the rest of his life trying to maintain a standard of living that didn't align with his values. Married to a woman who cared more about appearances than substance." She stood up and walked to the edge of my deck, looking out at my small backyard where I'd been planting flowers. "He's happier now than I've seen him in years. Even going through a divorce, even dealing with financial stress, he seems more like himself. He's found work that has meaning for him, I said. And he's reconnected with values that had gotten lost along the way. Jessica nodded. The ironic thing is, I think I could have loved the person he's becoming. The man who volunteers at animal shelters, who wants to help nonprofit organizations, who cares more about doing good than looking successful. But I spent so much time trying to change him into someone else that I never gave that version of him a chance. She turned back to face me. Margaret, I know this is probably too little too late, but I want you to know that I regret how I treated you. You didn't deserve it, and Brandon didn't deserve to lose his relationship with you because of my jealousy and insecurity. I looked at this woman who had caused me so much pain, who had systematically worked to destroy my relationship with my son, and I found that I couldn't hold on to my anger anymore. She looked genuinely remorseful, genuinely sad about the choices she'd made. Thank you for saying that, I said. I appreciate your honesty. I don't suppose there's any chance you'd consider asking Brandon to give our marriage another try. I shook my head gently. Jessica, that's not my place, and honestly I don't think it would be good for either of you. You both need to find people who love you for who you actually are, not who you might become. Jessica nodded sadly. I figured you'd say that, but I had to ask. She picked up her purse and prepared to leave. For what it's worth, I think you made the right decision about the trust fund. Brandon is becoming a better person because of what you did, and those animals are getting help they desperately needed. After Jessica left, I sat on my deck for a long time processing our conversation. I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected, an understanding of motivations that had puzzled me for years. Jessica hadn't been evil, just insecure and misguided. That didn't excuse her behavior, but it made it more understandable. That evening, when Brandon came over for dinner, I told him about Jessica's visit. He listened quietly, his expression cycling through surprise, sadness, and something that might have been relief. I'm glad she apologized to you, he said finally. And I'm glad she can finally be honest about what was really going on. Are you sad that it's ending? Brandon thought for a moment. I'm sad that we couldn't make it work. I'm sad that we hurt each other. But I'm not sad that it's ending. We weren't good for each other, Mom. We brought out each other's worst qualities instead of each other's best qualities. What do you think you'll look for in a relationship now? Brandon smiled. Someone who shares my values. Someone who sees helping others as more important than impressing others. Someone who would think it was wonderful that my mother donated $1 million to animal shelters instead of thinking it was a tragedy. That person exists, I said. And when you're ready, you'll find each other. The divorce was finalized the following month, just as Brandon had predicted. Jessica received a substantial settlement, including half the value of their house and a significant portion of Brandon's business assets. But rather than being devastated by the financial loss, Brandon seemed liberated by it. He sold the remainder of his interest in his consulting business and used the money to start a new venture, providing business consulting services to nonprofit organizations at reduced rates. His first clients were the 3 animal organizations that had benefited from my trust fund donation. Our trip to visit animal sanctuaries around the country was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. We spent 2 weeks driving through Utah, Colorado, North Carolina, and Tennessee, visiting facilities that rescued everything from abandoned farm animals to injured wildlife to exotic pets that had been surrendered by owners who couldn't care for them. At each stop, we learned something new about animal welfare, about the challenges these organizations faced, about innovative solutions they'd developed. Brandon took detailed notes, asking questions about operational efficiency, fundraising strategies, and program development. But more than the educational value of the trip, I treasured the time we spent together. Hours of conversation in the car, sharing meals at small-town diners, staying in modest motels, and laughing about the quirky decorations and outdated amenities. For the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back completely. On our last night of the trip, we were staying at a small bed and breakfast in the mountains of Tennessee. We sat on the front porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the hills and reflecting on everything we'd seen and learned. Mom, Brandon said quietly, I need to tell you something. What's that? This has been the best 2 weeks I've had in years. Maybe the best 2 weeks of my adult life. I felt my heart fill with warmth. Mine too, I keep thinking about all the time we wasted, all the years when we barely saw each other, when I treated you like an obligation instead of a person I loved. We can't change the past, I said. But we can make sure the future is different. Brandon nodded. I want it to be different. I want us to be close again, the way we used to be when I was younger. I want to be the kind of son you can be proud of. I am proud of you, I said. I'm proud of the man you've become, the changes you've made, the work you're doing now. Even though I wasted so many years. Especially because you recognized that you were wasting them and chose to change course. It takes courage to admit you've been wrong, to give up a lifestyle that looks successful from the outside but feels empty on the inside. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of crickets and nightbirds in the surrounding woods. Finally, Brandon spoke again. Mom, I have a confession to make. What's that? Part of me is grateful that you changed the trust fund. I looked at him in surprise. Really, if you hadn't done it, if Jessica and I had gotten that money, I think I would have continued down the path I was on. I would have bought the bigger house, maintained the expensive lifestyle, stayed married to someone who didn't really love me for who I am. Brandon leaned forward in his rocking chair, his expression serious. I would have been financially secure but spiritually bankrupt. I would have had money but no purpose, possessions but no real relationships, success but no satisfaction. And now I have work that matters. I have a relationship with you that's honest and real. I'm building a life based on my actual values instead of someone else's expectations. He paused. I don't have as much money, but I'm happier than I've been since I was a kid. Money can't buy happiness, I said, but it can buy choices. And you're choosing to use your resources and talents to help others instead of just accumulating more for yourself. I learned that from you, Brandon said. Watching how you lived, how you made decisions based on what was right instead of what was profitable or impressive. We returned home from our trip, with renewed energy and shared purpose. Brandon's nonprofit consulting business was thriving, with a waiting list of organizations that wanted his help. I continued my work with the animal shelter, and had been elected to the board of directors of the Regional Animal Rescue Network as well. But the biggest change was in our relationship. We talked on the phone several times a week, shared meals at least twice a week, and had developed traditions around holidays and special occasions. Brandon had moved into a smaller apartment that was only 10 minutes from my house, and we'd fallen into a comfortable routine of supporting each other through daily life. On the first anniversary of the day I'd changed the trust fund, Brandon showed up at my house with a bottle of champagne and a bouquet of flowers. "What's this for?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "I want to celebrate the day my mother saved my life," he said, grinning. We sat on my back deck, drinking champagne and talking about everything that had changed over the past year. The new animal shelter was fully operational and had already placed over 1,000 animals in homes. The rescue network had expanded to serve 6 additional counties. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had treated and released hundreds of injured animals. "Do you ever regret it?" Brandon asked. "Do you ever wish you'd given me a chance to prove I could change before you gave away the money?" I considered the question seriously. "No, I don't regret it. I think you needed to lose something important to you before you could understand what was truly important. And I needed to stop enabling your sense of entitlement before you could develop genuine gratitude. The tough love approach. More like the real love approach. Real love sometimes means allowing people to face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are painful." Brandon raised his champagne glass. "To animal shelters, life lessons and second chances." I clinked my glass against his. "To families who find their way back to each other." As the sun set over my small backyard, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago I'd been a lonely widow whose son saw her as a financial burden. Today I was surrounded by meaningful work, genuine relationships, and a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. The money I'd given away had been transformed into something far more valuable than financial security. It had become hope for abandoned animals, purpose for dedicated caregivers, and ultimately, redemption for a family that had lost its way. Brandon was right that I'd saved his life by changing that trust fund. But what he didn't fully understand yet was that he'd saved mine too. By giving me a reason to stand up for my values, to demand respect, to use my resources for something meaningful, He'd helped me discover who I really was underneath all those years of putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. The trust fund was gone, but the trust between us had been restored. And that, I realized, was the most valuable inheritance I could ever have hoped to leave behind. 2 years had passed since that champagne toast on my back deck, and life had settled into a rhythm I never could have imagined when I first made the decision to redirect Brandon's trust fund. The animal shelter had become a second home to me, and I'd been promoted to vice president of operations, overseeing everything from volunteer coordination to fundraising efforts. My modest salary from the position, combined with my investment income, had given me more financial security than I'd ever experienced. But it was a phone call on a humid Tuesday morning in August that would test everything Brandon and I had rebuilt together. I was in the shelter's new administrative office, reviewing adoption applications, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Arizona that I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Maria Santos with the Phoenix Police Department. I'm calling about your daughter-in-law, Jessica Henderson." My blood ran cold. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the divorce and the painful history, Jessica was still the mother of my future grandchildren, if Brandon ever remarried her, still someone who had been part of our family. "What's happened? Is she hurt?" "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Mrs. Henderson, and about some financial transactions that may have involved your family." The detective's tone was professional but serious, and I felt my stomach drop. "I'm not sure I understand. What kind of transactions?" "Mrs. Henderson was arrested yesterday on charges of investment fraud and identity theft. She's been operating a scheme that targeted elderly investors, and your name has come up in our investigation." I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. "Detective Santos, I haven't spoken to Jessica in over a year. I have no business dealings with her whatsoever." "That may be true, but we've found documents with your name and social security number among her possessions. We believe she may have been using your identity to establish credibility with potential victims." The room seemed to spin around me. "What do you mean, using my identity?" "She's been presenting herself as a financial advisor with family connections to successful investors. She's been telling people that her former mother-in-law was a wealthy philanthropist who had donated millions to charities, and using that story to convince people to trust her with their retirement savings." I felt sick. Even after our divorce, even after our confrontation the previous year, Jessica had found a way to drag me into her schemes. "Detective, I need you to understand something. Jessica and my son divorced over a year ago. I have no connection to her current activities." "We believe you, Mrs. Chen. But we're going to need you to come to Phoenix to provide testimony and to help us identify which documents are legitimate and which ones she may have forged." After I hung up with the detective, I sat in my office chair for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just learned. Jessica, the woman who had once called me a financial burden, had been using my reputation as a philanthropist to con elderly people out of their life savings. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate. I called Brandon immediately, catching him between client meetings at his nonprofit consulting firm. "Mom? What's wrong? You sound upset." I explained the phone call from Detective Santos, watching through my office window as volunteers walked dogs in the exercise yard, their simple act of caring such a stark contrast to the cruelty Jessica had been inflicting on vulnerable people. Brandon was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Jesus, Mom, I'm so sorry. I can't believe she would drag you into something like this." The detective said I need to fly to Phoenix to testify and help them sort through the documents. "Brandon, I'm scared. What if people think I was involved somehow?" "They won't," Brandon said firmly. "Mom, you have an impeccable reputation in this community. Everyone knows you're honest and ethical, and I'll come with you to Phoenix. You don't have to face this alone." 3 days later, we were sitting in the Phoenix Police Department, going through boxes of documents that Jessica had accumulated during her fraud scheme. The detective had explained that Jessica had been targeting retirees in Arizona retirement communities, using sophisticated presentations and fake testimonials to convince them to invest their savings in non-existent opportunities. She was particularly effective with widows. Detective Santos explained as we reviewed the evidence. She would tell them stories about how her former mother-in-law had been widowed young, but had managed to build wealth through smart investments and generous charitable giving. She'd show them photos of the animal shelter you donated to, newspaper articles about the facilities that were built with your money. I picked up one of the fake testimonials Jessica had created, supposedly written by me, endorsing her investment expertise. The letterhead was designed to look official, with my name and what appeared to be my signature at the bottom. "I never wrote this," I said, studying the document, "and this isn't my signature." "We know," Detective Santos replied, "but her victims didn't know that. To them it looked like you were personally recommending Jessica as a trustworthy financial advisor." Brandon leaned over to look at the document, his face growing pale. "Mom, look at this. She's claiming that you made $30 million in investments and donated most of it to charity. She's inflated everything about your story." The detective nodded. "According to our investigation, she told people that your charitable donations were part of a tax avoidance strategy that she could help them replicate. She promised them huge returns on their investments, while also allowing them to reduce their tax burden through strategic philanthropy." "How much money did she steal?" I asked. "So far we've identified over $2 million in losses from at least 30 victims. Most of them are elderly retirees who trusted her with their entire life savings." I felt physically ill. These were people like me, older adults who had worked hard and saved carefully, who had trusted someone they thought was reputable and experienced. The fact that my name and my story had been used to deceive them made me feel complicit in their suffering, even though I'd had no knowledge of Jessica's actions. "What happens to the victims?" Brandon asked. Detective Santos sighed. "That's the tragic part. Most of the money is gone. Jessica spent it on a luxury lifestyle, expensive cars, designer clothes, high-end jewelry. Some of the victims have lost their entire retirement savings. They may have to sell their homes, move in with family members, drastically alter their plans for their remaining years." The next day, we met with several of Jessica's victims at the district attorney's office. These were people in their 70s and 80s, who had been looking forward to comfortable retirements, but now faced financial ruin because of Jessica's deception. Eleanor Martinez was 82 years old, a former teacher whose husband had died 5 years earlier. She had trusted Jessica with the $400,000 she'd saved from her teaching pension and her husband's life insurance policy. "She seemed so professional," Eleanor told us, tears in her eyes. "She showed me pictures of the animal shelter you donated to, articles about your generosity. She said you'd started with very little money as a young widow, but had built wealth through the investment strategies she could teach me." Eleanor pulled out a folder of documents Jessica had given her, including fake account statements showing steady returns on her investments. "She said I could double my money within 3 years while also supporting charitable causes like you did." It sounded too good to be true, but she had all these credentials, all these references. I reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I had no idea Jessica was using my name or my story to hurt people." "I know that now," Eleanor said. "The detective explained that you weren't involved. But Mrs. Chen, I don't know what I'm going to do. That money was supposed to last me the rest of my life. I was going to leave some of it to my grandchildren for college." I squeezed her hand gently. "What if I told you that might still be possible?" Eleanor looked confused. "I don't understand." I looked at Brandon, who nodded encouragingly. We'd discussed this possibility on the plane to Phoenix, and he'd supported my decision completely. "Mrs. Martinez, I can't undo what Jessica did to you, but I can try to make it right. I'm going to personally reimburse you for what you lost." Eleanor stared at me in shock. "Mrs. Chen, you can't possibly do that. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars." "I have the resources to help," I said simply. "And I have a moral obligation to try to repair the damage that was done using my reputation." Over the next several hours, we met with 5 more of Jessica's victims, each with a similar story of trust betrayed and financial security destroyed. Robert Kim had lost $350,000 meant to pay for his wife's long-term care as she battled Alzheimer's disease. Martha Wilson had invested her deceased husband's pension, expecting to use the returns to help her disabled son. David and Patricia Thompson had trusted Jessica with their entire retirement fund, planning to use the income to travel and visit their children and grandchildren. To each of them, I made the same commitment. I would reimburse their losses, not because I was legally obligated to do so, but because I couldn't live with the knowledge that my name had been used to destroy their financial security. Brandon watched me make these promises with a mixture of pride and concern. On the flight back home, he voiced what I knew he'd been thinking. "Mom, you're talking about giving away nearly $2 million. That's a significant portion of your savings." I stared out the airplane window at the desert landscape passing below us. "Brandon, do you remember what you said to me 2 years ago? About being grateful that I'd changed the trust fund because it had saved your life?" He nodded. "Well, this is saving my life. I can't live with the knowledge that people are suffering because someone used my story to deceive them. I have money that I don't need for my own security, and they have needs that I can meet. But what about your own future? What if you need long-term care someday? What if there are medical expenses or other emergencies?" I turned to look at my son, this man who had grown so much over the past few years, who now understood the difference between having money and having purpose. "Brandon, I'm 70 years old. Even after reimbursing Jessica's victims, I'll still have more money than I can spend in my remaining lifetime. And more importantly, I'll have something money can't buy, the knowledge that I used my resources to help people who needed it." When we returned home, the process of reimbursing Jessica's victims took several months to complete. Each case had to be individually verified, legal documents had to be prepared, and bank transfers had to be arranged. But by Christmas of that year, all 6 victims had been made whole. The media attention was overwhelming. Local newspapers picked up the story of the elderly philanthropist who had voluntarily reimbursed victims of fraud, despite having no legal obligation to do so. National news outlets began calling, wanting interviews about my unusual approach to justice and charity. I turned down most of the interview requests, but I did agree to speak with a reporter from the Arizona Republic, who was writing a comprehensive story about Jessica's fraud scheme. I wanted people to understand that elder fraud was a serious crime with devastating consequences, and that communities needed to do more to protect vulnerable seniors. "Mrs. Chen," the reporter asked during our phone interview, "what would you say to people who think you're foolish for giving away so much of your own money to clean up someone else's mess?" I was silent for a moment, considering the question. I'd say that Jessica's victims didn't create this mess any more than I did. They were targeted by someone who exploited their trust and their desire for financial security. The fact that my name was used to deceive them creates a moral obligation for me to help, regardless of whether there's a legal obligation. "But surely you could have done something smaller, maybe set up a fund to help with partial reimbursements." "I could have," I agreed. "But these people lost everything because someone used my reputation to gain their trust. How could I sleep at night knowing that Eleanor Martinez might have to sell her home, or that Robert Kim couldn't afford his wife's medical care, or that the Thompsons couldn't visit their grandchildren because they couldn't afford to travel?" The article, when it was published, generated hundreds of responses from readers. Most were supportive, praising my decision to take responsibility for something that wasn't technically my fault. But there were critics too, people who thought I was being manipulated, or who believed I should have let the victims pursue Jessica through the legal system, rather than personally compensating them. One letter particularly stung. It was from a woman who claimed to be facing her own financial struggles, and questioned why I was helping strangers in Arizona while there were needy people in my own community. The letter made me wonder if I was being fair in my charitable giving, if I was neglecting local needs while focusing on dramatic gestures that would garner attention. I shared these concerns with Brandon during one of our regular dinners together. "Do you think I'm being foolish?" I asked him. "Do you think I should have let Jessica's victims recover what they could through the legal system instead of personally compensating them?" Brandon set down his fork and looked at me seriously. "Mom, do you remember what you told me when I criticized your decision to give my trust fund to animal shelters?" I nodded. "You said that you were choosing to invest in kindness, compassion, and unconditional love. That's exactly what you did for Jessica's victims. You saw people who were suffering, and you had the power to help them, so you did. But what about the criticism that I'm helping strangers while ignoring local needs? Are you ignoring local needs?" Brandon asked. "You serve on the boards of 3 different charitable organizations in this community. You volunteer at the animal shelter every week. You foster senior dogs. You've helped the food bank upgrade their refrigeration system. You donated money to help the library expand their computer lab." I realized he was right. My charitable giving hadn't stopped with the animal organizations or Jessica's victims. Over the past few years, I'd found dozens of ways to support my community, from small donations to local causes, to larger gifts that made significant improvements to public facilities. The difference, Brandon continued, is that you don't publicize most of your local giving. When you helped Mrs. Rodriguez next door pay for her husband's funeral, you didn't call the newspaper about it. When you funded scholarships for 3 kids from the neighborhood to attend summer camp, you didn't want your name on the awards. Brandon was right about that too. Much of my charitable giving was quiet and anonymous, directed toward individual needs that I discovered through my daily interactions with people in the community. So why did the Jessica situation become so public? Because it involved a criminal investigation and court proceedings. Because reporters found out about it when they were covering the fraud case. You didn't seek out the attention. 6 months later, Jessica was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. The judge noted during the sentencing hearing that while my voluntary reimbursement of the victims had reduced the financial impact of Jessica's crimes, it didn't diminish the severity of what she'd done. Mrs. Henderson systematically targeted vulnerable elderly individuals, the judge said. She exploited their trust, their desire for financial security, and their respect for charitable giving. The fact that the victims have been made whole through the generosity of Mrs. Chen doesn't excuse the defendant's predatory behavior. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing, but Brandon did. He wanted to see Jessica face the consequences of her actions, and he wanted to be able to tell me that justice had been served. I asked when he returned from Phoenix. Defeated, Brandon said. Like she finally understood that actions have consequences and that she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of this situation. Do you think she feels remorse for what she did? Brandon considered the question. I think she feels sorry for herself. I think she regrets getting caught, but I don't think she truly understands the suffering she caused those people. Jessica's imprisonment marked the end of a chapter in our lives that had begun with her calling me a financial burden and had ended with her using my reputation to defraud innocent people. But it also marked the beginning of something new and unexpected. Eleanor Martinez, the retired teacher whose savings Jessica had stolen, had stayed in touch with me after receiving her reimbursement. She'd sent thank you cards, photos of her grandchildren, updates on her life. What started as gratitude had evolved into genuine friendship. Margaret, she said during one of our phone conversations, I've been thinking about what you did for me and the others. You gave us back our financial security, but you gave us something else too. What's that? Hope. Faith and human decency. Proof that there are still people in the world who care about strangers, who take responsibility even when they don't have to. Eleanor paused, and I could hear her gathering her thoughts. I want to do something with the second chance you gave me. I want to use some of my restored savings to help other people who've been victimized by financial fraud. This conversation led to the creation of the Elder Financial Protection Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating seniors about financial scams and providing emergency assistance to fraud victims. Eleanor became the president of the organization, using her experience as both an educator and a fraud victim to develop programs that could protect other vulnerable seniors. I contributed the seed money to establish the fund, but Eleanor insisted on keeping my involvement minimal. This needs to be something that can exist independently, she explained, something that doesn't depend on one person's generosity but can attract support from many different sources. The fund grew quickly, attracting donations from individuals, businesses, and other charitable foundations. Within 18 months, it had helped over 200 fraud victims and had conducted educational seminars in retirement communities across the Southwest. Brandon became involved in the organization as well, providing pro bono consulting services to help them operate more efficiently and develop sustainable funding strategies. Working together on this project gave us yet another way to connect, another shared purpose that strengthened our rebuilt relationship. One evening, as we were reviewing financial reports for the Elder Financial Protection Fund, Brandon looked up from his laptop with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever wonder what Dad would think about everything that's happened over the past few years?" I set down the documents I'd been reviewing and considered his question. Richard had been gone for over 25 years, but I still thought about him regularly, still wondered how he would have handled various situations. I think he would be proud of both of us, I said finally. I think he would be proud that you found your way back to the values we tried to teach you when you were young, and I think he would be proud that I finally learned to stand up for myself and use our resources to help others. Brandon nodded. I think he would have liked seeing us work together on something meaningful. He always said that money was just a tool, I remembered. That what mattered wasn't how much you had, but what you did with it. Do you think he would have approved of you giving away my trust fund? I smiled at the question. I think he would have said that the trust fund served its purpose perfectly. It was supposed to ensure your financial security and help you build a good life. It did both of those things, just not in the way we originally planned. How so? The existence of that trust fund allowed you to take risks with your career that you might not have taken otherwise. Even subconsciously, knowing that you had that financial cushion gave you the confidence to start your own business, to make choices based on what you wanted rather than what you needed for survival. I paused, thinking about how the events of the past few years had unfolded. And losing that trust fund forced you to examine your values, to decide what kind of person you wanted to be and what kind of life you wanted to live. In the end, you ended up more financially secure than you would have been if you just received $1 million at 35. Brandon raised his eyebrows. How do you figure that? Because now your security comes from your skills, your reputation, your relationships, and your values. Those things can't be stolen or lost in a market crash or squandered on poor decisions. The trust fund money would have been finite, but the person you've become is an infinite resource. This conversation took place on a warm spring evening, almost exactly 3 years after I'd first changed Brandon's trust fund. We were sitting on my back deck, the same place where we'd celebrated our reconciliation 2 years earlier. But this time, we weren't just celebrating the past or the present. We were planning for the future. Brandon had met someone. Her name was Dr. Sarah Williams, and she was a veterinarian who ran a mobile clinic providing low-cost medical care to pets in underserved communities. They'd met when Brandon was helping the animal shelter develop a more efficient scheduling system for their spay and neuter programs. I want you to meet her, Brandon had said when he first told me about Sarah. But I want you to know that she's nothing like Jessica. Tell me about her. She drives a 10-year-old Honda that she maintains herself because she'd rather spend money on medical supplies for animals that need treatment. She lives in a small apartment because she donates most of her income to animal welfare causes. She's never eaten at a restaurant that costs more than $20 per person because she thinks expensive food is a waste of money that could be used to help animals. I'd laughed at his description. She sounds perfect for you. The crazy thing is, she already knew who you were before I told her you were my mother. She'd heard about your donation to the animal shelter, and she said you were one of her heroes. I'd met Sarah the following week, and Brandon was right that she was nothing like Jessica. Where Jessica had been polished and sophisticated, Sarah was practical and down to earth. Where Jessica had cared about appearances and status, Sarah cared about results and impact. Where Jessica had seen me as competition for Brandon's attention, Sarah seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person. Mrs. Chen, Sarah had said during our first meeting, I have to tell you that your donation to the animal shelter has made an incredible difference in the lives of thousands of animals. The new surgical facility has allowed us to take cases we never could have handled before. Please call me Margaret, and I'm glad the money has been put to good use. It's not just the money, though, that's obviously important. It's what your donation represented. It showed the community that animal welfare was worth investing in, that organizations like ours were doing work that mattered. Sarah had gone on to explain how my donation had attracted other major gifts, how foundations and corporations had started supporting the shelter once they saw the professional facilities and programs that were now possible. Your gift was a catalyst, she'd said. It didn't just fund new buildings and equipment, it changed how people think about the value of animal welfare work. Over the following months, as Brandon and Sarah's relationship developed, I'd gotten to know her better. She was intelligent, compassionate, and completely unpretentious. She shared Brandon's values about using resources responsibly and focusing on meaningful work rather than material success. More importantly, she understood and respected the relationship between Brandon and me. She never tried to compete for his attention or minimize the importance of our rebuilt bond. Instead, she seemed to appreciate the journey we'd taken together and the lessons we'd both learned along the way. One Saturday afternoon, Brandon called and asked if he could come over to talk to me about something important. When he arrived, he was carrying a small velvet box that he could barely keep hidden in his jacket pocket. "I want to ask Sarah to marry me," he said without preamble. I felt a surge of happiness for both of them. "That's wonderful news. But before I propose to her, I wanted to talk to you about something." Brandon sat down across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd once presented me with charts and graphs about my declining assets. "I've been thinking about the trust fund," he said. My heart sank slightly. After everything we'd been through, after all the growth and healing, was he still harboring resentment about that decision? "Brandon, I thought we'd resolved that issue." "We have," he said quickly. "That's not what I meant. I've been thinking about creating a new trust fund." I looked at him in confusion. "For who?" "For any children Sarah and I might have." Brandon pulled out a folder of documents, but these were different from the financial projections he'd shown me years earlier. These were articles about educational savings plans, charitable giving strategies, and values-based investing. "I want to set up something that will provide financial security for our kids, but I also want to make sure they learn the lessons I didn't learn until I was 35. Brandon opened the folder and showed me his plans. He wanted to establish a trust that would provide for his children's education and basic needs, but that would also require them to demonstrate certain values before they could access larger amounts. "I want them to have to show a pattern of charitable giving before they can receive their inheritance. I want them to have to volunteer with nonprofit organizations. I want them to have to demonstrate that they understand money as a tool for helping others, not just for accumulating possessions." I felt tears forming in my eyes as I looked at his detailed plans. "Brandon, this is beautiful. I learned from watching you that financial security isn't about having money, it's about knowing what your values are, and having the resources to live according to those values." He paused. "I want my children to learn that lesson early, not through painful experience like I did." "How much are you thinking of putting into this trust?" Brandon smiled. "That's the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. I want to start the trust with a significant contribution, but I want to fund it gradually over time through a percentage of my income from the nonprofit consulting business." He pulled out spreadsheets, showing projected contributions over the next 20 years. "If the business continues to grow the way it has been, and if Sarah and I continue to live modestly, we should be able to build a substantial trust for our kids while still supporting the causes we care about." I studied his projections, impressed by the thought and research he'd put into the plan. "This looks very well planned. I want to do better than my parents did." Brandon said, then immediately looked stricken. "I don't mean that you and Dad did anything wrong. I mean that I want to build on what you taught me." I reached across the table and took his hand. "I know what you meant, and your father would be so proud of what you're planning." "There's one more thing," Brandon said. "I want you to be involved in overseeing the trust. I want you to be one of the trustees, to help make decisions about when and how the money gets distributed." The idea filled me with joy. To be involved in shaping my future grandchildren's relationship with money and values. To help ensure they grew up understanding the importance of compassion and generosity, seemed like the perfect continuation of everything Brandon and I had learned together. "I would be honored," I said. Brandon's proposal to Sarah took place the following month at the animal shelter, surrounded by the dogs and cats they'd both worked to help. She said yes immediately, and they began planning a small, simple wedding focused on celebrating their commitment rather than impressing their guests. The wedding took place on a beautiful October afternoon in my backyard. We'd set up chairs for about 30 people under the oak tree, where Richard and I had once hung a swing for young Brandon. Linda Patterson, from the animal shelter, officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Sarah wore a simple white dress she'd bought at a consignment shop, and Brandon wore a suit he'd owned for years. Instead of expensive flowers, we decorated with potted plants from my garden that guests could take home as favors. Instead of a costly caterer, we prepared the food ourselves with help from friends and neighbors. But despite the simplicity, or perhaps because of it, the wedding was one of the most joyful celebrations I'd ever attended. The focus was entirely on the love between Brandon and Sarah, on the community of friends and colleagues who supported them, on the values they shared, and the life they wanted to build together. During the reception, Brandon stood up to give a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. 3 years ago, he said, looking directly at me, I thought happiness came from accumulating money and possessions. I thought success meant impressing other people and maintaining a lifestyle that looked perfect from the outside. He paused, his voice getting emotional. But I was wrong about everything. Real happiness comes from meaningful relationships, meaningful work, and the knowledge that you're using your life to make the world a little bit better. Brandon raised his glass. To my mother, who taught me that lesson in the most loving way possible. To my new wife, who shares those values and makes me want to be a better person every day. And to everyone here who understands that the best things in life aren't things at all. As our guests raised their glasses and drank the toast, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. My son had found his way back to the values Richard and I had tried to teach him. He'd found a partner who shared those values and would help him pass them on to the next generation. And I had found a purpose for my resources that went beyond anything I'd ever imagined. The trust fund I'd redirected 3 years earlier had been transformed into something far more valuable than money. It had become wisdom, compassion, purpose, and love. And unlike financial assets that could be spent or lost, these gifts would continue to grow and multiply through the generations. 6 months after the wedding, Sarah told us she was pregnant. As I watched her and Brandon plan for their first child, discussing everything from nursery furniture to college savings plan, I marveled at how different their approach was from the way I'd prepared for Brandon's birth 36 years earlier. Where I'd been anxious about providing financially for my child, they were excited about providing values and experiences. Where I'd worried about having enough money for emergencies, they were focused on creating a stable, loving environment. Where I'd seen parenthood as a huge responsibility to shoulder alone, they saw it as an adventure to share together. We want to raise children who understand that they're privileged, Sarah explained during one of our family dinners. Not just financially, though they will be comfortable, but privileged to live in a community where they can make a difference, privileged to have resources they can use to help others. How do you plan to teach them that? I asked. Brandon and Sarah exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication that develops between couples who are truly in sync with each other's thinking. We want them to grow up volunteering, Brandon said. Not as something they have to do to get an allowance or to put on college applications, but as a normal part of family life. And we want them to see us making decisions based on our values rather than our wants. Sarah added. We want them to understand that we choose to live in a modest house, not because we can't afford bigger, but because a bigger house wouldn't make us happier and would take resources away from causes we care about. I nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of environment children need to develop strong character. We've also been talking about how to handle gifts and inheritance. Sarah continued. We don't want to raise kids who expect to be given everything they want, but we also don't want to make them feel guilty about the advantages they'll have. This led to a long conversation about the trust fund Brandon was establishing, about how to structure it in a way that would provide security while encouraging responsibility. We discussed the importance of matching funds for charitable giving, of requiring volunteer service before accessing inheritance, of gradually increasing financial responsibility as the children matured. The goal, Brandon said, is to raise kids who see money as a tool for creating positive change, not as a measure of personal worth, or a way to buy happiness. 3 months later, I was holding my first grandchild, a beautiful baby girl they named Catherine Margaret Williams Henderson, combining Sarah's grandmother's name with mine. As I looked down at this tiny person, who would grow up in a world so different from the one Brandon had known, I felt hopeful about the future in a way I hadn't since Richard died. Catherine would never know what it felt like to worry about having enough money for basic needs. But if Brandon and Sarah succeeded in their plans, she would know what it felt like to use her privileges to help others. She would grow up understanding that love was more valuable than money, that character was more important than possessions, that generosity was a source of joy rather than a burden. Holding my granddaughter in my arms, I realized that the trust fund I'd redirected 3 years earlier had ultimately served its purpose perfectly. It had provided for Brandon's future, just not in the way I'd originally planned. Instead of giving him financial security, it had given him something far more valuable: the wisdom to create real security through meaningful relationships, purposeful work, and a clear understanding of what truly mattered in life. The money was gone, transformed into new animal shelter facilities, fraud victim reimbursements, and countless other charitable causes. But the love that had motivated that saving, the hope that had driven those investments, the values that had shaped those decisions, all of that lived on in Brandon, in Sarah, and now in little Catherine. As I rocked my granddaughter to sleep that first night, I whispered to her about her grandfather Richard, about the man who had started saving for her father's future before Brandon was even born. I told her about the love that had motivated every sacrifice, every careful decision, every penny saved over the years. "Your daddy learned some important lessons the hard way," I whispered to her sleeping form. "But now he can teach you those lessons with love instead of loss, with wisdom instead of worry." Catherine stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand grasping my finger with surprising strength. In that grip, I felt the future, full of possibility and promise. The trust fund was gone, but the trust between generations had been restored, stronger than ever before. 5 years later, I watched Catherine take her first steps across my living room, reaching for the photo of her grandfather Richard on the mantel. At 75, I'd seen enough to know that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in moments like these. Brandon had built a thriving nonprofit consulting firm, Sarah's mobile veterinary clinic, served 3 counties, and together they'd established a foundation that had helped over 50 animal welfare organizations. The trust fund I'd redirected had multiplied beyond money into something invaluable: a family that understood love, service, and gratitude. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what you leave behind, but what you teach others to carry forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.